Okay, we're ready to start with our next pioneer. This gentleman is, his name is Samuel Snow. He's number 9 in our series of the 27 pioneers that we've been covering. And the Lest We Forget issue, volume 3, number 2 that we did on him looks like this. It's entitled Behold. And it's obviously, if you're looking inside the word behold, there's the phrase, the bridegroom cometh.
This is the guy next to the end there?
This is this gentleman here, Samuel Snow.
Okay.
Picture of him. Right. Right. Okay, let's consider some highlights from the life of Samuel Snow. He was born in 1806. The first years of his life were spent apparently in infidelity, where he was caught up in joining with those who were skeptics. He supported what was entitled the Boston Investigator. If you go online, you can actually find information about this newspaper, published by an Abner Neeland, who was a pantheist. And those years, very, very interesting. You find these things out. There's pictures of Neeland on the internet, and it's amazing what you can find these days. So that was 27 years of age, 1833. Snow, by his own account, he published this account a few years later, and he's relating that. Until the autumn of 39, I rejected the Bible as foolish and trampled it under my feet. From 33 to 39, I was a constant patron of the Boston Investigator, the organ of the infidels, then conducted by Abner Neeland. I took an active part in this cause and was for several years an agent for the Investigator in Connecticut and a contributor to its columns. My friends from time to time took an interest in my welfare and called my attention to different books advocating the cause of Christianity. So you had people who were friends that had a burden that he actually understand the importance of Christianity. 6 years later, he's 33 years of age, 1839. He reads a book by William Miller, and he's converted. And here's his description of that experience. I took the book home and read it. And the more I read it, the more I was impressed with its truth. Again, this is Miller, the farmer from New York. This is 39, the same decade that Miller started his public work, right? I'm not even sure we know exactly which book it was that Snow got a hold of. It may have been his lectures. But here he is reading a book by a farmer, impressed with its truth. I compared it with the Scriptures, obviously had access to the Scriptures, and saw at once that it contained an argument that could not be rejected. I saw that everything was complete. I saw the perfect harmony between Daniel and the Revelations, and the history which is a perfect fulfillment of these revelations. I asked myself in all seriousness, how could this great knowledge be obtained unless it were inspired by God? I then saw that the Bible, which I had so long rejected, was the Word of God, and I melted down before it. This is taken from his remarks in the Midnight Cry publication, March the 7th of 1844, some 5 years later. He's recounting his experience. The next year, at the age of 34, 1840, he joins the Congregational Church because it was the only church where he resided. But that church itself was against the Advent faith. So you can imagine what that was like. Didn't last too long. 1842, at the age of 36, he began to preach the near coming of Christ. So he's gone from an infidel, in 3 years he's preaching. He's preaching the near coming of Christ. And this is the way he described it, again in these remarks. I felt that the period of man's probation on earth would terminate in 1843, yet I was unwilling to preach it, but preach the near coming of Christ. But my works were not blessed. So he could only get himself to say Christ is coming soon. He couldn't say he's coming in 1843. He wasn't able to preach the time prophecies. And
So he wasn't
his,
blessed.
in the works, his efforts were not that blessed. Finally, we come to 1843. He's 37 years old, and he made a full commitment at East Kingston, New Hampshire camp meeting. Do you recall our earlier study on Himes, when they bought the big tent? That it was in 42, summer of 42, they pitched it for the first time at East Kingston, New Hampshire. So apparently this is a year later, summer camp meeting a year later, and Snow comes to that camp meeting. Probably the big tent's there. And he makes a full commitment. Sometimes the Lord takes us through a process, right? Of deeper and deeper commitment. He makes a full commitment. And then, this is how he described it. All that I have seen and all that I now see seems more and more to confirm the truth found in the Bible. The truth there established has been the lamp to my feet and a light to my path. I believe that as certain as the Bible is God's truth, that just so certain the next event will be the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. My fervent prayer is, come, Lord Jesus. Still very good Adventist words, right? Even though this was stated before the passing of the time, and with a little bit of understanding. But yet it's still very, very applicable to who we are and why we're here. We come now to the year 1844, and the next 5 events here recount things during that year. He's 38 years old this year, Samuel Snow. You can see by and large these are young people. They're not real young people, but they're people that are in their prime of life. Obviously the people that we're working through are getting younger and younger during the 40s because we're going through these chronologically by birth year. In that year, his own study led him to look at the fall of 1844. And he wrote to the editor of the Midnight Cry regarding it. And this was published February 22 and March 7, both before the first disappointment, notice. Before the spring of 44, which was what they call the first disappointment. He's writing, there may be some need to look at the fall of this year as the time that we should be focused on. The next event was that spring date passing that they expected him, the first disappointment, and he wrote more of the fall date in the following issues of the Midnight Cry, May 2, June 27, August 22, and September 19, all the way through from spring through summer. He's writing more and more about this fall date. That spring, after the spring date passed, he moves to Worcester, Massachusetts. In May of that year, also in the Midnight Cry, William Miller himself pointed out several Jewish events that suggested the 7th month as a possible time for the Advent and recommended the Day of Atonement as worthy of prayerful consideration. You aware of that? Miller himself, shortly after the spring disappointment, he's saying, let's prayerfully consider that. There's some things in the Jewish types that point to the fall. So you can see how God was preparing their minds to accept what was coming. August the 15th is the big date that relates to Snow's experience and his contribution. August the 15th of 1844 was the Exeter, New Hampshire camp meeting. And at that camp meeting, there was strong acceptance of the fall date. And here's how James White describes it. James White was there, and this is in his book called Life Incidents, also on the CD-ROM. James White, starting at page 159. God evidently had a special message for that people to be attended with his signal blessing. Let me interject this. James's description of what was happening at this huge encampment, thousands of people there, is amazing. Because the people that came from the different places brought their own tents. And they would not only tents to sleep in, but they were tents to gather in. So it was like there's sub-meetings and sub-gatherings. And there were some people that were just having a loud time all night long. And I think James said that the group he was with picked up their tent and moved it away from them so that they could get some sleep. In other words, there was tremendous fanaticism going on in the midst of God's moving, because the devil always tries to come in and bring a counterfeit, confuse people. So have that in mind as we're reading this. There's a lot going on, and we have a hard time picturing how an interesting gathering these things were. God evidently had a special message for that people to be attended with his signal blessing. Men of ability spoke of the great lines of prophecy, which proved that the advent of Christ was the next great event, and of the signs that the event was at the door. But this was as familiar to that crowd of intelligent believers as the alphabet. Just then, as one was speaking with but little force and interest, and the people were becoming weary of being told in a dull, prosy style what they already knew, a middle-aged, modest-appearing lady arose in the center of the audience, and in a calm manner, and with a clear, strong, yet pleasant voice, addressed the speaker as follows. "It is too late, brother. It is too late to spend our time upon these truths, with which we are familiar, and which have been blessed to us in the past, and have served their purpose and their time." The brother sat down. The man that was speaking, obviously.
Wasn't that Bates?
There's other accounts that indicate that it wasn't Bates speaking, but here the name is left out. The brother sat down, and the lady continued, with all eyes fastened upon her. "It is too late, brethren, to spend precious time as we have since this camp meeting commenced. Time is short. The Lord has servants here who have meat in due season for his household. Let them speak, and let the people hear them. Behold, the bridegroom cometh. Go you out to meet him." This testimony seemed electrifying, and was responded to by choked utterances of amen from every part of the vast encampment. Many were in tears. What former speakers had said was forgotten, and the spirit of fanaticism, which an hour before lay upon the burdened feelings of the brethren and sisters like a ponderous leaden weight, was also forgotten. By the request of many brethren, the next morning, the arguments were given from the stand, which form the basis of the 10th day of the 7th month movement. The speaker was solemn and dignified, and showed to the entire satisfaction of that vast body of intelligent believers his evidences. Who was that speaker?
No.
The man that we're looking at, Samuel Snow. Samuel Snow. August the 22nd. How many days later is that? 1 week later. 7 days later. Snow publishes, he edits something called the True Midnight Cry regarding these evidences that he has. And it's published by E. Hall Jr. in Haverhill, Massachusetts. And these are the sections. I've summarized them just briefly here for you. These are his headings. And I've given you, what follows is just a brief sort of concluding remarks from each of these sections. And it lets you know where his thinking was going, what he was basing his reasoning on. You see the 5 sections, right? 6,000 years, 7 times to the Gentiles, 2,300 days, 70 weeks, and the types. Let's look at each of these. The 6,000 years. He said, looking at Ussher's chronology, and he adjusted because he felt Ussher missed some time during the times of the judges. You adjust that, and the 6,000 years will end within AD 1844.
6,018.
From the creation of the world. From his calculations, okay? That's what he did. You can read the entire paper is on the CD-ROM as well.
So 6,000, he took 6,000 years only to 1844?
Yes.
Instead of what a lot of Christians do, take it
Yes.
to about 2,000.
Yes. Yeah, you can look at the details of how he did that. I'm not going to get into that right here. Number 2, 7 times of the Gentiles. The 7 times of the Gentiles' domination over the church of God, spoken in Leviticus 26, began with the breaking of the pride of their power at the captivity of Manasseh, king of Judah, BC 677. From that time, 20 years reaches to the autumn of AD 1844.
Interesting word. The breaking of the
Pride of their power. Yeah. Third line of evidence, the 2,300 days. They therefore commenced when they began to build in the autumn of BC 457. From that point, 2,300 years reached to the autumn of AD 1844. Number 4, And this is basically from Daniel 9, but as obviously dealing with some of the same dates of Daniel 8, but ties in, anchors itself in to the first coming of Christ in a very powerful way, the New Testament events. As Jesus Christ was crucified in the midst or middle of the week, and on the day of the Passover, which was the 14th day, that should be, of the first month, it follows that the week began in the 7th month of AD 27 and ended in the 7th month of AD 34. This was the termination of the 70 weeks. From that point, 1,810 years remain to the end of the 2,300 days. In other words, 2,300 minus 490, right? Which is the 70 weeks. And from the 7th month of AD 34, 1810 years extend to the 7th month of AD 1844. So he's doing the 2,300 on both 3 and 4, but he's factoring the 70 years for number 4, which is basically the events during Christ's first coming, the crucifixion. And then finally, number 5 is fifth line of reasoning, the types. And I've given you a little bit more detail here because this is where he's dealing with on the types. Another type is given in Leviticus 23, verses 26 to 32. That is the Day of Atonement or Reconciliation on the 10th day of the 7th month, in which the high priest went into the most holy place of the tabernacle, presenting the blood of the victim before the mercy seat. After which, on the same day, he came out and blessed the waiting congregation of Israel. The high priest was a type of Jesus, our high priest. The most holy place, a type of heaven itself. And the coming out of the high priest, a type of the coming of Jesus, the second time to bless his waiting people. As this was on the 10th day of the 7th month, so on that day Jesus will certainly come, because not a single point of the law is to fail. All must be fulfilled. Our blessed Lord will therefore come to the astonishment of all them that dwell upon the earth, and to the salvation of those who truly look for him on the 10th day of the 7th month of the year of Jubilee. And that is the present year, 1844. So you can see the definiteness with which this is presented and the impetus or the impact that it had on the people. I wanted to read just briefly to you something that we've looked at before in other settings, but I think it's useful to consider it here briefly again. This is Ellen White's description of what happened under the 7th month movement, the Midnight Cry. This is from Great Controversy, page 400 and following. In the parable of Matthew 25, the time of waiting and slumber is followed by the coming of the bridegroom. This was in accordance with the arguments just presented, both from prophecy and from the types. They carried strong conviction of their truthfulness, and the midnight cry was heralded by thousands of believers. Like a tidal wave, the movement swept over the land. From city to city, from village to village, and into remote country places it went, until the waiting people of God were fully aroused. Fanaticism disappeared before this proclamation like early frost before the rising sun. Believers saw their doubt and perplexity removed, and hope and courage animated their hearts. The work was free from those extremes which are ever manifested when there is human excitement without the controlling influence of the Word and Spirit of God. It was similar in character to those seasons of humiliation and returning unto the Lord, which among ancient Israel followed messages of reproof from his servants. It bore the characteristics that mark the work of God in every age. There was little ecstatic joy, but rather deep searching of heart, confession of sin, and forsaking of the world. A preparation to meet the Lord was the burden of agonizing spirits. There was persevering prayer and unreserved consecration to God. Miller said, in describing that work, there is no great expression of joy. That is, as it were, suppressed for a future occasion, when all heaven and earth will rejoice together with joy unspeakable and full of glory. There is no shouting. That too is reserved for the shout from heaven. The singers are silent. They are waiting to join the angelic host, the choir from heaven. There is no clashing of sentiments. All are of one heart and of one mind. Another who participated in the movement testified, it produced everywhere the most deep searching of heart and humiliation of soul before the God of high heaven. It caused a weaning of affections from the things of this world, a healing of controversies and animosities, a confession of wrongs, a breaking down before God, and penitent, broken-hearted supplications to Him for pardon and acceptance. It caused self-abasement and prostration of soul, such as we never before witnessed. As God by Joel commanded, when the great day of God should be at hand, it produced a rending of hearts and not of garments, and a turning unto the Lord with fasting and weeping and mourning. As God said by Zechariah, a spirit of grace and supplication was poured out upon His children. They looked on to Him whom they had pierced, and there was great mourning in the land. And those who were looking for the Lord afflicted their souls before Him. Of all the great religious movements since the days of the apostles, none have been more free from human imperfection and the wiles of Satan than was that of the autumn of 1844. Even now, after the lapse of many years, all who shared in that movement and who have stood firm upon the platform of truth still feel the holy influence of that blessed work and bear witness that it was of God. At the call, the bridegroom cometh. Go you out to meet him. The waiting ones arose, trimmed their lamps. They studied the word of God with an intensity of interest before unknown. Angels were sent from heaven to arouse those who had become discouraged and prepare them to receive the message. The work did not stand in the wisdom and learning of men, but in the power of God. It was not the most talented, but the most humble and devoted who were the first to hear and obey the call. Farmers left their crops standing in the fields. Merchants laid down their tools, and with tears and rejoicing went out to give the warning. Those who had formerly led in the cause were among the last to join in this movement. The churches in general closed their doors against this message, and a large company of those who received it withdrew from their connection. In the providence of God, this proclamation united with the second angel's message and gave power to that work. Again, recall the sequence of the messages. First angel's message was proclaimed beginning with Miller and continued. When the churches began to oppose the work, Fitch was the one who began to say, Babylon has fallen, come out. And now she said very plainly here, the midnight cry joins with the second angel's message and gives power to it. Let's keep that in mind, because we'll find that she speaks about another cry coming, because the last of the messages in Revelation is another cry. What did they call that cry? The loud cry. And she said she saw that it was coming with 10 times the power of the midnight cry.
And we're closer now. We need this experience now.
We need this. This will be repeated under the loud cry in a way. What I was just reading was Great Controversy, pages 400 and 400 to 402, from page 400 to 402. So it's easily accessible. We need to see the significance of the midnight cry. By the way, this midnight cry, in Ellen White's very first vision, which came later that year, December of 44, correct? In that vision, what was she shown? She was looking for the Advent people, and she couldn't see them. And the voice said to her, look again and look a little higher. So she looks up, and there she sees them. And what does she see them on? A path leading from earth to heaven. Okay. And what does she see at the beginning of the path? A bright light. And what did that light do? Where did it shine? It shone all along the path to the city. Okay. And the angel told her what the light was. What was it? The midnight cry. Okay. Midnight cry. The message of the bridegroom. Okay, the midnight cry is the message of the virgins, right? And the message was a message focused on the bridegroom, and they were enamored with the bridegroom, right? So again, it's a Christ-centered. But in her vision, it was a little bit different types of symbols, not a wedding party, but it's a journey, right? And the people were on the path, and who were they following? Jesus, who was leading them. Okay? And the light at the beginning of the path enabled them to see Jesus. But when they denied the light that was behind them, what happened? Light went out. They couldn't see Jesus. They couldn't see the path, and they fell off. Do you see the significance of the midnight cry? Do you see the significance of the light that's behind us? Matthew 25 is the scriptural heart of it. But historically, this is the historical account of it. And it was a movement unlike any movement since the days of the apostles. And again, it was a movement that was focused on the bridegroom, on Christ. Following him by faith, not knowing exactly where he's going to lead. They thought he was going to come to this earth, and here they're still on a path going to heaven. But that's the picture that we have, and we need to understand the significance of that midnight cry.
But the midnight cry will it be repeated?
My understanding is that all the messages that have come in their order, first angel's message, second angel's message, midnight cry, and later on, the next message was the third angel's message after the passing of the time. The Laodicean message came next, message of the seventh church, and then finally the loud cry, which began, we're told, in our history in the 1880s. All of those messages, all 6 messages, are still the message for now. They are to be given, and they will come with greater power. They haven't finished. But the power that was at the beginning will return with even greater power under the loud cry.
And the glory of the Lord, which is that other image.
Revelation 18 is glory filled the earth.
10 virgins will apply again before Jesus is.
Yes, right. If you look at Christ's object lessons on the last chapter in Christ's object lessons on the parable of the virgins,
That will be fulfilled just before.
she applies it to the second coming of Christ, actual second coming of Christ. But here it's applied to the Advent believer's experience. And following him then was by faith into the most holy place, which is where the wedding was taking place. The later application will be when he actually returns to this earth. The bridegroom comes. You had a comment?
Who were the people on the path?
The Advent believers.
The bride?
Yes.
Why was the bride following her husband? Why does a woman go with her husband? You got to take all these terms in marriage context.
Mm-hmm.
These people who are following Christ, and where are they headed to from the earth?
To the city.
The holy city.
Mm-hmm.
He says, I go to prepare a place for you. If I come again, I will receive you unto myself and take you where I am. So what these people are doing is they have found these matchless charms of Christ,
Right.
and they have given their heart as a bride does to her husband.
Right.
That's why they follow.
Right.
And it's that light of who Christ is what lights their path. And that's why they follow him.
Right.
Because they love him.
Now review that.
They love them.
Review that vision again, her first vision, because he raises his hand and there's light that comes from his hand. Okay, they are enamored with the bridegroom.
Yes.
Their focus is totally on him, and that's where they're headed.
Yeah.
And if they take their eyes off of him, it's over.
So what they've done is they've become forgetful of self,
Right.
their righteousness, or the lack of it,
Right.
and looked at his righteousness.
His matchless charms.
To guide them along the way.
That's right.
That is
That's-
what God has in mind for us
That's right.
today.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, they have their eyes on Jesus, but she also says they're continually praising and shouting. So they have an active part also.
Right. Yeah. You can imagine a wedding party that's not silent.
No.
Praising and shouting and joyous expressions of happiness. So that's the picture that we have. So that, again, was the 7th month movement that began late summer of 44. And then we have to move on in this process. We come to October 22, and again, the great disappointment. This passing of the time that we're seeing in each of these life stories, right? From different angles, different viewpoints. And you can imagine what Snow went through. What Samuel Snow went through. You can try to imagine what he went through. A person who was used most clearly to enunciate the details of the evidence pointing to that. Okay? Let's see. By December of that year, he preached that the Advent was to be in the fall of any year between 1843 and 1847. He rejected the message of Edson that we just studied in a previous overview regarding the heavenly sanctuary work of Christ, and he broke with other Millerites who opposed new date setting. So you can see what's happening to him. Okay? The advancing light that he helped to actually point toward, he doesn't go with.
It moved on.
It moved on. January of 45, at the age of 39, he moves to New York to pastor the Franklin Hall congregation there, and he adopted what was called the shut door theory of Joseph Turner. If you read our history, a lot of the early pioneers, particularly Loughborough, talked about this. What was that, the shut door theory? The date was correct. The event was an error, but here's the event. The bridegroom came spiritually and shut the door to his house, and only those who entered October 22 were saved. All others were lost. That was the shut door. Okay. Now, there was another way in which our Seventh-day Adventist pioneers used shut door. They talked about the door in Revelation that was shut and another one open. In other words, Christ's ministry has moved from the holy place to the most holy place. So you have to be careful as to what shut door you're reading or it's referring to when you're reading about the shut door thing. But the shut door theory of Joseph Turner is the one that's specifically here that Samuel Snow adopted. The next month, February of 45, the Franklin Hall Church dismissed him. By the next month, he and his supporters founded a new church called the Mount Zion Church, and he began the Jubilee Standard to promote his shut door teaching, and there were 21 issues published that year through August. 3 years later, he's 42 years old. He writes a book, Overflowing Scourge, and he claims to be the prime minister of King Jesus. Here's actually his words from this book. By the special favor of God, through Jesus Christ, I have been called and commissioned to go before the face of the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah, to prepare the way for his descent from heaven. As his prime minister, I demand of all kings, presidents, magistrates, and rulers, civil or ecclesiastical, a full surrender of all power and authority into my hands on behalf of King Jesus, the coming one. War, famine, pestilence, and destruction shall go forth among the nations more and more, till the earth be utterly desolate. Then shall ye know that a prophet hath been among you.
Didn't think much of himself, did he?
What did he become? A false prophet.
Became exalted.
A false prophet.
Yeah.
I think I heard about this guy.
That's Sunday.
They were
That's
on the news
Get
Sunday, talking about this guy thinks he's Jesus Christ.
Yeah. That was page 4 of his book, Overflowing Scourge. Some 15 years later, he's now 57, he publishes a book called The Voice of Elias, a commentary on Daniel and Revelation. He's still working on the prophecies. But you can imagine probably what he does with it in the light of where he's gone. 5 years later, 1868, age of 62, Mount Zion Church Manual is published called The Sacred Symbol. I don't know very little about that. And a couple of years later, 1870, July 13, age of 64, we're told that he preached his last sermon at Mount Zion Church. To be honest with you, I don't know what happened the next 20 years. But 1890, in July, at the age of 83, he died. And this, in the Hartford Courant, July 29, 1890, this notice was found. And this is actually online as well. In Greenpoint, Rhode Island, July 27, Samuel Sheffield Snow, age 83, a native of Ashford, Connecticut. Obituary notice. So, what can we learn reflecting upon the life of Samuel Snow?
Let him who thinks he standeth take heed lest he fall.
Let him who think he standeth take heed lest he fall.
A man think he is something, and when he is nothing,
Yeah.
he deceives himself.
And unless we continue walking in the light, the devil has a deception designed for us.
Exactly.
So this man came out of infidelity, was convicted on the truthfulness of the Word of God. The prophecies were laid out before him. Joined the Advent movement, became its primary voice in beginning the seventh month movement, pointing to October of 1844. And the seventh month movement was used powerfully by God, as we read. Most significant movement since the days of the apostles. And again, God's purpose in all of that was to focus people's attention on Christ. And when he didn't show up on earth, like the disciples of old, to say, where have they laid him? Where is he? You know? And then to find the light into the most holy place. And unfortunately, this gentleman, when that light began to shine, did not walk in that light. And he clearly became a false prophet, claiming all types of privilege and position that was actually bizarre in its character.